1969. A packed American arena. Bright lights, polished smiles, everything exactly where television wants it. The host rolls through the introductions, momentum building, until a chart-topping star with a spotless image leans into the microphone and smirks. And now, the man in black. Let's hope he didn't bring the prison with him. Laughter spreads fast. Safe laughter. The kind that knows who it's laughing at. Cameras cut to Johnny Cash. He doesn't look away. He doesn't stiffen. He smiles. Not the kind that defends itself. Not the kind that plays along. It's calm, measured, almost patient. In that instant, the room thinks the joke landed. It hasn't. What no one in the crowd understands, what the producers won't realize until it's too late, is that this smile isn't surrender. It's a decision. Within 30 minutes, nothing will explode. No insults will fly. No headlines will scream. But one career will quietly tilt off its axis. And it will happen without Johnny Cash saying a single word in response. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The studio smelled of hot cables and cigarette smoke that had soaked into the curtains long before this night. It was late in the decade, the kind of evening when television still pretended to be polished while running on nerves behind the lights. A full orchestra waited in pressed jackets, instruments resting on knees, pages clipped so the air from the fans wouldn't lift them. The audience had been warmed up carefully, applause signs tested, laughter encouraged, everyone told where the fun was supposed to happen. Johnny Cash stood off to the side, half in shadow, dressed in black that absorbed the glare instead of reflecting it. By then, he was already a name people spoke with certainty. Records sold. Prisons remembered him. Yet in rooms like this one, with their tidy jokes and clean smiles, he was still treated as an odd shape that didn't quite fit the frame. The singer before him fit it perfectly. Bright suit. Easy grin. A voice trained to land softly. When the host prompted a little banter, the man leaned into it without effort. He gestured toward the wings, toward the black silhouette waiting its turn, and made a remark about gloom, about dressing like a funeral in a business built on cheer. It wasn't cruel. That was the trick. It was light enough to feel safe. The audience laughed right on cue. Cameras cut fast, hunting for a reaction. They found Cash standing still, hands loose at his sides. No tightening of the jaw, no flash of anger, just a calm face, and, after a beat too long for comfort, the hint of a smile that didn't explain itself. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't wounded. It simply existed. The laughter thinned as people realized there would be no spectacle in return. Backstage, the mood shifted. A stage manager whispered that things could be adjusted. A producer suggested smoothing the night, keeping it light. Cash's manager leaned close and spoke fast, offering options. Skip a song, swap the order, give the audience something safer so the moment would pass. Cash listened without interrupting. He nodded once, slow, as if weighing something heavier than the room. When he spoke, his voice stayed low, steady enough that no one leaned in to hear. He said they'd leave the set alone. Almost. Then he asked for one change, a small one. Not louder, not softer, just first. The manager hesitated, eyes flicking toward the clock, toward the orchestra, toward the running order taped to the wall. This wasn't how television worked. But Cash had already turned away, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket, grounding himself before the walk into the light. A floor director counted down with raised fingers. The orchestra straightened. Somewhere in the crowd, a few people were still smiling, waiting for the next joke. Cash stepped forward as the announcer said his name, the applause polite and uncertain. Just before the first note was supposed to land, he lifted a hand, not to stop the band, but to guide them somewhere else. A different opening. One that hadn't been rehearsed, but was known well enough to be trusted. The red light on the camera burned steady. And as he leaned toward the microphone, the room sensed that whatever had just been laughed at was no longer the point. He didn't explain the close. No gesture, no sentence to guide the audience toward meaning. The black suit simply stood there under the lights, absorbing color, draining the stage of its usual shine. In a room built for sparkle, it felt like a refusal. The orchestra waited for a familiar cue that never came. Instead, Cash nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and the band slid into a different rhythm, slower, heavier, unannounced. A few musicians glanced at their charts, then back at him, trusting the years more than the paper. This wasn't unusual for him, but it was unusual here. Television liked predictability. This was something else. The first notes settled into the studio like dust. No laughter followed. No applause rushed in to fill the space. The audience didn't know yet what it was being asked to do, so it did nothing. Silence, thick and watchful, replaced the earlier ease. Cash leaned toward the microphone without hurry. His voice came in low, worn, carrying the weight of places that never saw bright lights. He sang as if the room were smaller than it was, as if he were addressing a handful of people instead of rows of faces trained to respond on command. The song wasn't bitter. It wasn't loud. It didn't argue its case. It stated facts the way he always did, letting them stand without decoration. Halfway through the first verse, he paused, not long enough to break the flow, just enough to shift it. He looked out past the front row, past the cameras, and spoke a single line, barely above a murmur. He said it was for the ones who never got introduced, the ones who didn't fit cleanly into stories that ended well. Then he went right back into the song, as if the words hadn't been meant to land. Something changed in the room. Shoulders lowered. A woman in the third row stopped smiling and folded her hands together. The applause sign stayed dark. No one missed it. Behind the set wall, the earlier singer watched from a monitor, his grin gone. He stood with his arms crossed now, posture stiff, eyes fixed. The joke he'd made felt suddenly loud in memory, like laughter echoing in a place it didn't belong. He said nothing. There was nothing to add. Cash didn't look toward him. He didn't look toward anyone in particular. He sang straight ahead, voice steady, unadorned, letting the song finish without pushing it toward a reaction. When the last note faded, he held still for a moment, hands resting lightly on the microphone stand. The response came late. Not the burst producers hoped for, but something slower, uneven, real. Applause rose in pockets, then spread, cautious but sincere. It wasn't approval in the usual sense. It was recognition. Somewhere near the control booth, a producer exhaled sharply, already calculating how this would play on the broadcast. This wasn't the tone they'd planned. It couldn't be trimmed without losing its core. Cash stepped back as the clapping continued, face unreadable. The band lowered their instruments. The room had crossed into a place that didn't allow easy jokes anymore. And as the lights shifted for what was supposed to come next, it was clear that the night had already slipped beyond the outline everyone thought they were following. The applause didn't crash in. It arrived the way weather does when it changes its mind. One section at a time, unsure of itself, testing the air. Cash waited it out without moving, eyes steady, posture loose. When it finally settled into something whole, he lifted his head slightly and let that familiar smile return. Not wide, not warm, just enough to register. It landed harder than anything he'd sung. The host stepped forward too quickly, words tumbling ahead of his plan. This wasn't how the segment was supposed to breathe. There were cue cards for moments like triumph or embarrassment, not for this in-between space where meaning hung without instructions. He made a comment about unexpected moments and laughed alone, then glanced toward the band as if they might rescue him. Cash didn't rush to fill the gap. He adjusted the microphone once, a small scrape of metal cutting through the lingering claps. When he spoke, his voice stayed level, conversational, almost gentle. He thanked the orchestra. Then, without turning his body, he addressed the earlier remark that everyone remembered, but no one wanted repeated. He said he appreciated a good joke, said it was nice to be reminded that not everyone saw the world the same way. Then he nodded toward the wings and mentioned the other singer by name, thanking him for keeping the night lively. There was no edge in it, no pause to underline anything. That was the trouble. The compliment didn't resolve cleanly. It shifted the room. People glanced at each other, trying to decide what they'd just witnessed. The smile stayed on Cash's face, unchanged, refusing to signal victory or forgiveness. He gave the audience a brief look, then stepped back, leaving the host to regain control of a night that no longer followed him. Behind the curtain, the singer who had joked earlier stood frozen for a moment before moving. He approached with practiced energy, hand extended, words ready. He spoke quickly, explaining tone, intention, the harmlessness of it all. Cash listened, nodding once, eyes attentive but distant. When the explanation ran out, Cash replied with a few quiet words that didn't address any of it. He said it was a good crowd, said the song had felt right. Then he excused himself, turning away before the other man could answer back. There was no dismissal in the gesture. That was what lingered. No argument to replay later. No story to tell that made either of them the center. Just a conversation that ended without permission to continue. As Cash walked down the narrow hallway toward his dressing room, the sounds of the show resumed behind him, music, laughter, cues snapping back into place. But the rhythm was off now. Something had slipped. By the time he closed the door and sat down, loosening his tie, the smile was gone. In its place was calm, the kind that comes from knowing nothing more needs to be said. Outside the studio, the night kept moving, unaware that a quiet line had just been crossed. And in the days ahead, that unfinished moment would refuse to stay where it happened, following both men into rooms where the lights were softer and the silence asked better questions. The days after the broadcast didn't explode the way everyone expected. No headlines screamed about insult or retaliation. Instead, something quieter began to circulate. Reviewers mentioned a shift in tone. Columnists wrote about an episode that felt heavier than planned, though no one could point to a single line that caused it. The moment resisted neat framing, and that made it linger. Reporters started calling the other singer first. He laughed it off at the beginning, using the same charm that had always worked. It was friendly humor, he said, respectful. He'd meant nothing by it. The words came quickly, rehearsed almost on instinct. But when follow-up questions pressed, about the silence, about the song choice, about that smile, the rhythm faltered. He repeated himself, changed phrasing. The ease thinned. When microphones turned toward Cash, the answers dried up instead of expanding. He declined interviews politely, thanked people for watching, and redirected every question back to the music. He didn't confirm there had been tension. He didn't deny it either. Names never crossed his lips. The absence of reaction became its own kind of statement, one the press couldn't sharpen into a blade. Inside the network offices, the conversation took a different shape. Producers replayed the tape, noting how the pacing slipped from their hands. The segment ran long. The laughter track never recovered. One executive admitted, off the record, that the performance had broken an unspoken agreement. This kind of show was supposed to glide, not stop, and look down. There were murmurs about risk, about unpredictability, and beneath it all, a reluctant respect. The singer who had joked felt it first in small ways. Invitations paused. Phone calls went unanswered longer than usual. No one accused him of wrongdoing, but the tone had changed. In meetings, he noticed people listening more carefully when Cash's name came up, as if something had been recalibrated. Cash kept moving. Shows. Travel. Long drives between towns that didn't read trade papers. But even there, the night followed him. Promoters mentioned the broadcast in passing, describing it as strong, or unexpected, or simply nodding without comment. He took it in without reacting, storing none of it on his face. Weeks later, a benefit event placed them in the same building again. Different city, smaller room, no cameras. They passed each other in a hallway barely wide enough for two men. For a moment, neither spoke. Then a brief exchange of looks, recognition without challenge. They continued on without stopping. What had been laughter had thinned into something else entirely. Not shame, not apology. Awareness. The joke no longer traveled well. It lost weight each time it was remembered, until all that remained was the silence that followed it. And in that silence, the industry adjusted its footing, uncertain why, only knowing that something had shifted and wouldn't quite shift back. The room was smaller than the television studio, and that mattered. No audience risers, no cue lights, just a long table, a few chairs pulled out of alignment, coffee gone cold in paper cups. It was the kind of industry space meant for decisions, not performances. Conversations here didn't echo. They stayed. Cash arrived early and took a seat near the wall, back straight, hands resting loosely in his lap. He listened more than he spoke as people filtered in. Engineers, a producer, two writers arguing quietly about a bridge that wasn't working. It was ordinary, comfortably so. The other singer came in last. No bright suit this time. A muted jacket, collar open, eyes scanning the room before settling on Cash. He hesitated, then crossed the space without humor to lean on. For a moment, he said nothing. The pause stretched just long enough to feel intentional, then uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke, low and unpolished. He said he'd been thinking about that night more than he wanted to admit. Said he hadn't expected the silence, or the way it followed him. Cash turned slightly, giving him his full attention without changing expression. The singer went on, stumbling now, words less practiced. He admitted that jokes were easier than saying what he meant, that the image he sold left little room for weight. He waited for a rebuke, or worse, a polite dismissal. Cash didn't offer either. He nodded once and said he understood. Said there was a time when he'd aimed to be agreeable, too, when fitting in felt safer than standing still. He didn't linger on details, just mentioned that the cost didn't show up right away, but it always arrived. There was no lesson attached, no advice handed down, just a statement, set gently between them. The singer absorbed it in silence, shoulders easing as if he'd been bracing for something heavier. He asked one more question, whether Cash ever regretted stepping out of line. Cash shook his head. Not because it was easy, he said, but because it was necessary. Then he stood, signaling the end of the exchange without cutting it short. As he moved toward the door, the singer watched him go, saying nothing. The room resumed its quiet industry hum. Someone cleared their throat. A chair scraped. Later that evening, almost unnoticed, The singer crossed out a line in his notes. A small change. No announcement, no explanation. Just an adjustment that would matter later. Cash walked out into the evening air alone, the city settling around him. He didn't look back. He rarely did. Nothing happened all at once. That was the strange part. No public apology. No statement issued through a press office. The industry moved the way it always claimed to. Forward, distracted, hungry for the next thing. And yet, under the surface, decisions began to bend in small, almost invisible ways. The singer who once leaned on jokes noticed it first in rehearsal rooms. Lines that used to come easily felt thin when spoken aloud. He cut one, then another, telling no one why. The laughter they used to guarantee now seemed out of place, like noise left on after a conversation had ended. When asked about the changes, he shrugged and said the songs needed room to breathe. That was all. Producers took note without naming it. A few stopped encouraging mockery as a shortcut to charm. Not because it was suddenly wrong, but because it felt dated. One mentioned, half joking, that audiences were listening differently now. No one argued. They simply adjusted. Cash stayed out of it. He toured, recorded when it made sense, turned down things that didn't. Invitations began arriving from rooms that once kept him at a polite distance. Formal events, careful stages, places where unpredictability used to be a liability. The requests didn't mention that night. They didn't have to. Trust had replaced novelty. At one meeting, a young artist asked him how to handle being misunderstood. Cash answered with a story about timing, about learning when not to fill the silence. The advice sounded simple. It wasn't. Months passed. The moment on television softened in memory, but its shape remained. People referenced it obliquely, as a turning point they couldn't quite describe. After that, they'd say, without finishing the sentence. The singer who had once joked found himself watching Cash from a distance again, this time with attention instead of judgment. He noticed how little explanation followed him, how rooms settled when he entered. It wasn't authority. It was permission. To be still, to be honest, to let a song stand without apology. When they crossed paths again, there was no ceremony, just a nod, an understanding that didn't need words. By then, the shift was already complete. Not dramatic enough for headlines, too quiet for credit, but lasting. And as another shared stage approached, neither man framed it as a reckoning. It was simply the next place where silence would have to decide what mattered. The hall was larger this time, built for ceremonies and careful words. The lights were warmer, less intrusive, and the crowd carried itself differently. Older, quieter, listening before being asked to. Programs rustled, then stilled. This wasn't a night for surprises, or so it seemed. The singer stepped to the microphone first. No jokes this time, no easing into the moment. He introduced the next name plainly, voice steady, eyes forward. He spoke about influence without exaggeration, about learning when to step aside and let a song speak for itself. He didn't reference the past. He didn't need to. The respect was clear in what he chose not to say. When Cash walked out, the reaction came without prompting. It wasn't loud. It didn't surge. It rose and held, filling the space evenly, like breath shared across a room. He acknowledged it with a small nod, nothing more. The black suit was there again, unchanged, unremarked upon. He took his place, adjusted nothing, and waited for the sound to settle. It did. When he smiled, it was the same one that had confused a studio months earlier. Calm, unreadable, unclaimed. But now the room understood it differently. Not as defiance, not as restraint, as certainty. He didn't address the audience. He didn't offer context. He sang. The performance passed without spectacle. No dramatic ending. No lingering pose. When the final note faded, he stepped back, letting the silence close naturally before the applause arrived. It came softer than expected, but deeper. People stayed seated. No one rushed the moment. Backstage, there were hands to shake, words offered and accepted. Cash moved through it with ease, neither lingering nor hurrying. When he reached the exit, he paused briefly, looking out at the emptying hall. The singer who had introduced him caught his eye and inclined his head. Cash returned the gesture and kept walking. Outside, the night air was cool, unremarkable. He stood alone for a moment, listening to nothing in particular. There was no feeling of triumph, no sense of having won anything. That wasn't the shape of it. What remained wasn't a lesson or a line anyone would quote. It was the memory of a choice, to answer without answering, to stand without pushing back. The laughter from that first night no longer mattered. It had already faded. What stayed was the quiet that followed.